Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Barbara Hunter. I'm the Executive Director of the National School Public Relations Association. I am so delighted you are here with us today to hear all about data and how to write more positive and credible headlines with data. We know this is going to be a fabulous webinar because John Gatta, your extraordinary presenter, did this session at the national seminar and the NSPRA seminar in July, and it was standing room only. So I know you're in for a great webinar. I just wanted to take a minute and thank John, who is a partner with NSPRA. He and ECRA are wonderful partners, and we have put this together for your information and learning, and I know it's going to be a great session. So thank you, John. And with that, have a great webinar.
Great, thank you, Barbara, and thanks for hopping on the webinar, and thanks to everybody that have taken the time out of your day to come hear about this this important topic. So today we're going to talk about how to write more positive and credible headlines with data. And so before we get started, a little bit about myself. My name's John Gatta, and I am the CEO of ECRA Group, a partner of NSPRA. And as a firm, we really are dedicated to helping school districts improve by adopting more evidence-based practices, but as a component of that, really helping those that are in communication roles, superintendents, chief communication officers, directors of communication, use data more effectively to write more positive and credible headlines and just to communicate more effectively overall. My background is sort of half academic, half entrepreneur. In addition to my role as CEO of ECRA Group, I am a professor of data science at Northwestern University. So I've spent my whole career working with data, both through the lens of research, continuous quality improvement, but I've also done a lot of work on just how do you use data to communicate effectively. And that's the topic of today's conversation. And one of the things that I've learned throughout all of my professional careers is that when you start to use data to communicate effectively, and this is particularly true about schools, is that the more accurate you can be, the more positive your message. And so this is not about spin. This is not about how do we take the data and make it say what we want it to say. This is about using a concrete process that's more scientific, more accurate, and the byproduct of that is really more positive headlines, more credible headlines, more succinct headlines. And so my goal for today is for you to walk away from here with a very concrete set of steps that you can use and put into practice immediately back in your school district. As Barbara mentioned, we are a partnership. We are in partnership with NSPRA, both as it relates to this content and the professional development, but also as it relates to a tool, our strategic dashboard tool, to help you implement the ideas that I'm going to talk about here today. So the bulk of this presentation will be sort of general professional development techniques that you can use irrespective of the tool. But at the end, we will go through how you can implement these ideas easier using our strategic dashboard tool, which was specifically designed to implement the techniques that I'm going to go through here within this presentation. And I'm also going to end with a special offer as part of our partnership with NSPRA that you can take advantage of to get access to this tool at a significant discount. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So from the most broad standpoint, what we're talking about here today is we're talking about taking a vision, right? All of you have some version of a strategic plan running within your school district. Maybe it just runs under the label of board goals, or maybe it runs under the label of a strategic plan. Maybe it just runs under the label of a vision or a portrait of a graduate. But you have some vision, some goalpost in the future that you're striving towards. But the idea of using data to communicate more effectively is to really get ourselves to focus on measuring and communicating what matters, and really going from this idea of a vision to a set of strategic indicators. Many of you may use the word KPIs, key performance indicators, as a as sort of a synonym for that. We like to use the word strategic indicators, but throughout this presentation, if you hear strategic indicator or KPI, we really mean the same thing there. And that's really what today's focus is going to be. How can we choose the right metrics, and then how can we follow a three-step process to communicate data more effectively? And the byproduct of that, again, is more efficient communication, more strategic communication, and ultimately more positive and credible communication. And so with that, I'm going to start with a couple of examples from other industries. I've learned over the years that if we can start this by just thinking about what else exists in other industries and how do they use strategic indicators to really focus on communication and really focus on this idea of what really matters to us as a school system. And so when you think about an airline, for example, that's the first example I want to start with is percent of on-time arrivals. Think about that for a minute. This is a very simple metric. This is a metric that's intuitive. It's easy to understand, right? But it matters, right? You cannot be an airline executive and not know what that number is, right? You just have to know what the percent of on-time arrivals is. And everybody that works for an airline just has to know what that is. It's fundamental to accomplishing the mission of an airline that it's something that just has to be communicated and talked about all the time. And so that's a great example of a strategic indicator in that it's simple, it's intuitive, and it's fundamentally tied to the mission of an airline, which is to get people from point A to point B safely and predictably. Another good example is from healthcare, and that example is readmission rates. So this is an indicator that hospitals monitor quite diligently because it's tied to funding mechanisms, but it's also tied again to this mission of theirs is to make sure that if people interact with the system, if they have to come to the hospital, that when they're discharged, that they don't have to come back. And usually it's readmission rate within the first 30 days is the metric that they use. But again, it's simple to understand. It's tied fundamentally to the mission, and it's something that can be used to communicate hospital quality really easily. And that's the same of the airline example. Think about how easy these metrics are to communicate in terms of messaging who we are and what we stand for. And the last one is from economics, and that's the inflation rate. We're going to do a more detailed example of this one. But if you're an economist, right, and you're trying to communicate sort of a fundamental piece of the economy, I chose this just because it's a modern example because we can't really read any news article or turn on the news without always being subject to this inflation rate conversation. But again, it's strategic because it's fundamentally tied to the health of the economy. And so when we talk about communicating the economy and being able to strategically message where the economy is, inflation rate is just one of those that just is, it matters. And so this constant idea of how do we start this process by measuring what matters? And measuring what matters is a matter of definition. So the first part of this process is to really think about the vision, think about the mission of what it is that your school district that you represent is trying to accomplish, and then start to operationalize that a little bit in terms of maybe your strategic plan has a goal area around student success. Maybe it has a goal area around learning environment. Maybe it has a goal area around finance and operations. But what do we really mean when we say student success? Do we mean academic proficiency? Do we mean academic growth? Do we mean advanced programming access, co-curricular involvement? By the learning environment, do we mean class size? Do we mean teacher retention? Do we mean student safety, parent satisfaction? When we're talking about finance and operations, what do we really mean? Do we mean enrollments? Do we mean financial adequacy? Do we mean academic return on investment or debt capacity? The idea here is to arrive at a small number but manageable set of strategic indicators that you can focus all of your communication on and all of your reporting on. Effectively using data to communicate is not about communicating all of the various data elements that you may come in contact with, but it's this idea of sampling. It's the idea of, can we curate a collection of strategic indicators that collectively represent who we are and what we're trying to create, and then focus all of our communication on those indicators, no more, no less. And so The remainder of this presentation is going to be taking you through a 3-step process over and over and over again with different examples about how you would choose an indicator and how you would choose a benchmark and ultimately write a headline associated with a particular indicator. So this is the process we're going to use, and this is the process that I recommend that you take back to your districts and try as a result of this presentation. And this is also the process that drives the strategic dashboard tool because it's organized in this capacity. So we have to define a strategic indicator, then we have to establish a benchmark, and then we are going to communicate a headline by comparing the value of our indicator to the value of our benchmark. And this is going to become more clear as we go through a series of examples. But the key piece of this when we define an indicator is that these strategic indicators, they have to be strategic in the sense that they have to be fundamentally tied to what it is that you're trying to accomplish as a school system, and they have to be intuitive. When you think about the airline examples of percent of on-time arrivals, that is strategic because it's fundamentally tied to the mission of the airline, but it's also intuitive. You know immediately what that is without needing much additional information. Then, equally as important is choosing our benchmarks. And so benchmarks is just a term that's used to represent a sort of a guidepost or a relative value that adds context to the data that you're trying to communicate. And so, I mentioned that I've studied my whole career, around using data effectively in a variety of contexts. And I can tell you that what I've learned is that a number should never live alone, is that if you have a number, in order to interpret that number properly, in order to communicate that number properly, you got to put another number next to it, right, that adds context. And then you can really understand it, and then you can communicate. That number or that context usually comes in one of 4 ways. It comes in a normative reference. So you've seen this lots of times, right, where you might have percent of students meeting or exceeding state standards, and then next to it you would put maybe the value of the nation or the value of the state or maybe the value of peer districts, right? That's the example of a normative reference that you put next to it. Some value that exists in a larger group that you can compare it to. But they also take on the definition of a baseline value. You see this a lot, and I'm gonna show you an example of this one as well. Is you can establish the benchmark by just saying this is what the value was at some point in time, right? At some point in the past, and then you can monitor progress as time goes on as to are we improving? Are we pulling away from that baseline value? So benchmark as baseline is another great way to establish a benchmark. You can also establish a benchmark by using a projected or expected value. This is used a lot in the financial industry, and it's certainly used a lot in the education industry as it relates to student growth, but also as it relates to finance too, where you talk about this is what the number is, but this is what we expected the number to be based on a set of assumptions. And that's another way to formulate the benchmark. And finally, the way you can formulate a benchmark is by a target or policy value. It's simply by using research or using board policy to say, this is the value that we want to be above or below. So that could be just establishing a benchmark policy value for your fund balance. That could be establishing it for debt capacity, but that could either be establishing it for class size or other examples that we're going to give. And so as we work through this presentation, you will see an example of each one of these benchmarks, how to use these benchmarks to just communicate more effectively using data. And so then once we have the strategic indicator, once we have the benchmark, then we can just communicate more effectively by comparing the value of our indicator to the value of our benchmark, and things proceed pretty smoothly. So let's start with our first example, inflation. And so I chose inflation just because it's widely used in today's sort of media environment, and it serves as a great way to illustrate these points. And so let's define it, let's establish a benchmark, and let's communicate the headline. And then I have examples of how media outlets did this. And so one of the most common ways to measure inflation, it's not the only one, but by far probably the most common that gets reported most in the media, is the increase in the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. And that is the average price for a basket of goods and services. right? So we sort of have this basket of goods and services, and then we see how the price of that basket sort of moves over time. What you may not know is that the CPI is anchored to a baseline, right? And this is just the way that it works, is that it's really the average price for a basket of goods and services between 1982 and 1984. So this is a perfect example of how we can communicate CPI to the general public more effectively by establishing this baseline that we reference all the values to. You can see this in play if you look at media coverage. I'm taking actual news articles that were released on April 12th, 2022, and I chose that because that's when the first sort of foray of inflation hit the general public, that all of a sudden it became mainstream in terms of all the inflation that's happening. And so the USA Today wrote the headline, "Inflation rose at fastest pace in 40 years in March as consumer prices jumped 8.5%. CNN, consumer price inflation hit a new 40-year high in March. And Fox, inflation surges 8.5% in March, hitting a new 40-year high. How did three different news outlets basically write the exact same headline? They wrote the exact same headline because they all referenced the same baseline value. They basically just took the current value, compared it to the baseline value, and then wrote a headline that was consistent of that. And I think it's a perfect example of how the use of a benchmark, in this case the baseline, just makes communication much, much easier. Now let's hop into an example, and we're going to go through a few of these that deal with more education-related indicators. And so we're going to start with student proficiency because it's one of those indicators. It's on all the state report cards across the nation. You can't really be in a school system and not be forced to communicate student proficiency in some capacity, whether it's to your local board, your local community, or even a broader set of stakeholders. So we're going to go through the same process. We're going to define a strategic indicator, we're going to establish a benchmark, and then we're going to write a headline that compares the value to the benchmark. And remember what I said before about what I've learned is that if you can be more accurate, more contextualized, right, you're going to end up writing more positive headlines and at the same time be more credible because it's more scientific. And this is a perfect example of that. So what metric of proficiency should we use? So that's the first step in this process, is we do have to define what it is that we mean by student proficiency. For the sake of this presentation, because you could define that a variety of ways, one of the most common ways, at least through the lens of state assessment systems, is percent meeting or exceeding state standards. And so that's our metric that we're going to use to measure proficiency. And so if we need to message to the Board of Education because our state report cards just got released and now the board wants an update on, and the community wants an update in terms of how do proficiency rates look, this is a great example and process that you can use. So how are we going to establish a benchmark? Well, let's first motivate why it's so important that we establish a benchmark to begin with as part of this process. Here's real data from the state of Illinois, and I just use this data because it's a great example. You could find similar examples all across the nation. This is just the percent meeting or exceeding state standards in Illinois. This is real data, right, in mathematics going back over the last 15 years, okay? Do any of you want to communicate this data? Because this is data without a benchmark, right? This is just a raw metric on percent meeting or exceeding state standards. This is a very difficult thing to communicate. One, because at face value, it starts to look really negative, but two, it's really not accurate. Because if you take this data at face value, there's only a few statements or headlines that you're going to write from this, right? Unfortunately, one of the statements or headlines will be that over the last 15 years, student proficiency rates across Illinois dropped from over 90% to less than 50%. Not a great headline, right? Or maybe if you're just focusing on the most recent data, the headline becomes that roughly, across Illinois, this particular district is only at 50% or less than 50% students meeting state standards. This gets spun in the community as less than half the kids of this district are at grade level. Well, that's not really true, right? So let's establish a benchmark, right? So what we could do is we could just put the state value right alongside of it, right? So now things become a little bit more interesting, and we're going to even do better than this, but automatically the statements that you can make, one, they're more contextualized because you have this reference point, right? And two, they begin to be a little bit more accurate from the standpoint of giving the reader or the consumer a better understanding of what's a high value and what's a low value. Because at least from adding this one line to the graph, now the statement becomes that this particular district has outperformed the state 15 consecutive years in a row, and the margin by which they've outperformed has widened over time. And so that's a really important statement, but we can actually do better than that. And so the actual value for this particular district is 52% students meeting or exceeding Illinois standards. Okay, so again, if you just report this number in isolation, the basic takeaway is only half of the kids are at grade level. That's how it's going to be spun, right? But if you convert this to a percentile, what you realize is that's at the 90th percentile. This is real data, right? And all we've done here, this is the same exact data. All we've done is we've introduced a benchmark. And by introducing a benchmark, our headline now, instead of reading latest test results reveal only 52% of students meet grade level standards in math, that would be the headline if we didn't introduce the benchmark. By introducing the benchmark, our headline becomes School A's mathematics performance in the top 10% of Illinois schools for the 15th consecutive year based on latest test results. Much more positive, actually much more credible, because it's much more contextualized, much more scientific from the standpoint of adding reference values that are meaningful. And so you can see this is the same exact data. We introduce a benchmark, and our statement becomes more credible and more positive at the same time. Let's look at another example. This particular example is student growth. And so this is another indicator, strategic indicator that you normally have to report onto the Board of Education and the community. Proficiency kind of goes along with growth. Let's go through the same exact process. Define an indicator, establish a benchmark, communicate the headline, right? But we're talking about student growth here. So how might we define student growth? Again, this is a choice, and it's the first step in the process. Are we going to do it via effect size? Are we going to do percent of students meeting or exceeding growth projection, average or median growth percentile, percent of students showing expected or higher than expected growth? One of the most commonly used metrics to communicate growth is that second one, percent of students meeting or exceeding growth projection. But as you're going to see here, if you just report that number without reporting a benchmark, you're going to have a headline that's not so positive, but it's also not being interpreted accurately. And so this gets a little bit technical, but it demonstrates this idea that how you define the metric matters and how you define the benchmark matters. Okay, so there's too many people on this call for me to sort of like do a shout out here, but it turns out this is a rhetorical question here. So what percentage of students do you think across the nation meet or exceed their growth projection? So it turns out that that's a number that's set in stone. It's the same number all the time because it's formulaically derived to be 50%. So by definition, 50% of students across the nation will meet or exceed their growth projection. But that's not really what we're after, right? What we're really after is this idea of what percentage of students are actually growing according to national growth profiles, right? So if we, instead of focusing on this projected value absent a benchmark, if we can superimpose a benchmark on this, we can move the statement from 56% of students met or exceeded their growth projection, that to an untrained eye, they may interpret that as, again, just like proficiency, you're saying just barely only half of our students are growing as we would have expected them to. Well, no, that's not necessarily true. Just because only 56% of students met or exceeded their growth projection, that doesn't mean, that doesn't have anything to do with what percentage of students are actually consistently growing in terms of what you'd expect given national growth profiles. And so Headline 1 would read 56% of students met or exceeded their growth projection. You introduce a benchmark, again, same exact data. All we've done is introduce a benchmark, and now the statement becomes 90% of students met or outpaced the nation in academic growth. Another perfect example of same data. All we did was define the indicator, and we introduced a benchmark, and now we have a more contextualized, more positive, and ultimately more credible headline because of that. We'll do one or two more examples, and then I'm going to dive a little bit into the product and the opportunity that you have here today as part of this webinar. So ultimately, as the pandemic has receded and as ESSER dollars are driving up, we're constantly getting this question of like, so how do I start to communicate to the board and the community how we've spent money and the impact that it's having? Well, we use the same exact process again. We define an indicator, we establish a benchmark, and then we communicate a headline, right? And so in this case, I'm going to demonstrate using a benchmark as a projected or expected value. That's why I chose this example too, because we've dealt with a benchmark as a policy value, as a baseline, as a normative reference, but now I want to try one that has this idea of an expectation or projection. So when we put kids in programs, for example, so your school or district may have used a lot of ESSER dollars in a variety of ways. You may have spent them on instructional coaching or additional staff or specific kinds of programming or technology, right? But how do you really know if the program is working, right? Well, you don't just want to look at where students ended up with the program. You want to sort of set an expectation in terms of where would students be had they never participated in the program at all. So again, it's this idea of establishing a benchmark or a control group. When medicine does sort of experiments to determine, let's say, whether drug A is better than drug B to reduce blood pressure, right? They don't just look at whether drug A reduced blood pressure, right? They look at whether drug A reduced blood pressure compared to some control group or some expectation of what would have happened, right, with a comparison value. And so this is an idea of just introducing a projection or expectation alongside of it, introducing some benchmarks associated with that, in this case, just research-based effect size benchmarks that are widely available, right? But then you can report things in a more meaningful way, meaning how did we spend money, what was the financial allocation, and the actual effect that we received as a result of that investment. But now when you think about the potential headlines that come from this, headline 1 without the benchmark would be district spends $135,000 on instructional coaching. Doesn't really say all that much, right? You introduce a benchmark, and now the statement becomes investment in instructional coaches is having a significant and positive impact on student growth. Again, all we did was introduce a benchmark, and now we were able to write a more positive and more credible headline because ultimately we presented a more accurate and scientific way of looking at the data. And so now, since this group is so large, normally I would ask people to shout out, so please don't do that. But we're going to do this a little bit rhetorically, these last couple of examples. And I'm just going to give you maybe 10 seconds or so to think about it before I sort of give you the answer here, or not the answer, but like my way of thinking about this is, so let's say your school in your district just received the Blue Ribbon Status Award, and it's your job to communicate this. Now, I deliberately chose this example because it's a different kind of example, more of a qualitative indicator. It's not a number, but you can apply the same methodology that we've been using to write a more positive and credible headline, right? And so without the benchmark, you might write a headline that just says, our school received the Blue Ribbon Award. But I want you to think about how you can use the concept of a benchmark, right, to write a more positive and credible headline as it relates to this. So I'm just going to sit tight for maybe 10 seconds, and I want you to just think about that for a minute. So one way you could think about that is just think about a benchmark as a normative reference, right? And compare that to, so how many districts, across the nation get this award? By doing that, then your headline becomes school receives prestigious Blue Ribbon Award by U.S. Department of Education and elite designation for top 1% of schools. Again, we just applied the same methodology. We defined an indicator, we established a benchmark, and then we just compared our value to the benchmark. And our final example here, which is, I think a tricky one, but I think it's a good one to end on here, is class size. It's one of those that a lot of people have to communicate, right? And so how do you best communicate class size? Well, I want you to take the same ideas here and think about a benchmark that would help you communicate class size. So I'm going to start this off by, if you did not have a benchmark, right, average class size, your headline might be the district's average class size is 22. Now, I want you to think about how you might establish a benchmark to write a more positive, but ultimately a more credible headline, right? And remember, benchmarks can be normative, they can be policy values, they can be baselines. You could think about that a variety of different ways. I'm going to think about this, for the sake of this example, as more of a benchmark as policy value, right? If you do that, then you can just essentially set where you want class size to be based off of assumptions of balancing sort of cost and academic concerns, because class size is one of those interesting ones, right? If class size gets too high, right, it's good for finance, but it's not good for students. If it gets too low, it's good for students, but it's not good for finance. And so class size is one of those where we really want sort of a range that we consider optimal to balance cost and benefit. So all you have to do in this scenario is establish sort of a zone by policy that you believe strikes the right balance between cost and benefit, and then your headline becomes, the district hits its target for average class size by balancing cost and benefit. Again, what did we do here? We just added a reference point. And in this case, our reference point just came from policy that we've set that we believe is the right value for class size to be, that balances costs and benefits. And you can see how that headline changes by introducing that benchmark. And so now I'm going to move towards, how do you actually put all this into practice? And so one of the things that I mentioned up front in this webinar is our partnership with NSPRA is not only to provide the kind of professional development that we just went through here, but also to provide a tool to implement these ideas, right? So how do you actually take what you've learned here, take it back to your district, implement it in a way that you can share with the Board of Education, share with the community, and begin to change the way in which you use data to drive communications. Now, before we hop in here, I want to give a little bit of a plug to an opportunity you have as part of a member of NSPRA, and part of our launch of our NSPRA partnership is up until October 1st, we are offering a special NSPRA 50% discount on the dashboard product that we're going to go through here in just 1 second. And so if you follow that link and you use partner code NSPRA 2023, you will receive a 50% discount on this product if you purchase it before October 1st. And so we can talk more about that at the end for those that have questions. I would recommend as you begin to formulate your questions, if you could just throw those in the chat, and I will begin to monitor the chat as questions come in. And at the end, I'll just work through the questions coming through the chat as a way to do this in an orderly fashion. But one of my colleagues has also put the link for where you can find out more about the strategic dashboard and how you can purchase that in the chat, so you can go ahead and just click on that. And so with that, I'm going to launch the dashboard product that I've spoke about. And this is in partnership with NSPRA. And so in the beginning of the presentation, I talked about how you have to go from vision to indicators, right? And using data effectively is about measuring what matters, right? So it's about choosing the right indicators. Ultimately, that has to be tied to the vision of the school district. But once you've gone through that process, the idea here is, and what you're looking at are the indicators page of this product. And this is going to be, more of just a sneak peek into the product because we don't have time for a long, lengthy demo. But what I hope you see is the connection between the ideas that I presented and how you implement those ideas easily within the strategic dashboard product. And so one of the things that you'll see here, remember I had that example where I said, well, there's a goal area around student success. There's a goal area around learning environment. There's a goal area around finance and operations. Now this will look different for your school district. I would recommend that you start with your strategic plan and tie to the 3 to 5 strategic goal areas that are in your plan. But then you have to go the next level, right? Just like we had talked about the process, you define the indicator, you establish the benchmark, and then you communicate the headline. So that first part about defining the indicators is deciding what are going to be the strategic indicators that we monitor as a school district, right? And then only sticking to those indicators as what you communicate. So you go through a process, you arrive at the indicators, and then once you have your collection of indicators, all of your communication just focuses on those. And this just becomes the way in which you communicate everything about the district. It all comes back to the dashboard. And so, for example, for student success, right, you may have student proficiency, you might have student growth, you might have advanced learners, you might have student engagement, co-curricular involvement, workplace learning, graduation rate, college pathways. You can define any of these any way that you want. Learning environment, finance and operations, all of this is completely customizable by just clicking this admin mode, and you can add new indicators. You can define them however you need to define them. You can change the order of these by just dragging them around in the order that you want them to be. But one of the important pieces here is it follows exactly the professional development that I brought you through. You name the indicator. Here, you establish the metric, you give it a description. Then you can add benchmarks that allow you, just in my example that I had in the slide deck, to add a benchmark to it so that you can write the headline. And so this particular example of proficiency, the one that was in the slide, I've implemented it in the dashboard that shows that longitudinal view of proficiency. It shows the benchmark that I've created for the metric, and then I'm able to write my headline. And so again, this idea is the district has consistently outperformed the state related to academic performance. Furthermore, the margin by which the district outperforms the state has widened over time. The tool allowed you to define the indicator, establish the benchmark, and then write a headline that compared the indicator to the benchmark. If you do this across all of the indicators that you create, then this becomes the way in which you report data to the Board of Education, you report data to the broader community, and this is the way that you even point media that are covering the district, because you're controlling the metrics that are out there, you're controlling the benchmarks, and you're ultimately controlling the message by writing the headline for them. And so the nice thing about this particular product is once you've built out your indicators and benchmarked and wrote your headlines, you can turn on, think about YouTube as sort of an example of this. You can decide, and you can control this in a very granular way, you can turn on dashboards or parts of dashboards publicly, and you can get a shareable link just like you do with a YouTube video, where you have a video and then you can get a shareable link, and then you could put it on your website, or you can put it in a board doc, or you can share it, amongst other stakeholders. And so that's a really nice way to begin to get everybody thinking about success with the same measures, the same benchmarks, and ultimately talking about the same headlines. And so what you're looking at here is the actual product that you would use to build the dashboard, but I'm going to go ahead and drag this in here too. This is ECRA's public website, right? And if I hit View Strategic Dashboard, it generates the same dashboard but from a public view. And the reason I was able to do that is just because I went into the settings of that other dashboard and got a shareable public link that then I could link to our public website. And now that dashboard is available publicly to the board, to the community, to other audiences that you think are important to have access to that. And so again, it serves as a really nice way of being able to get everybody talking about the same pieces of data, the same benchmarks, and ultimately the same headline.